So tell me a little bit about yourself and like your religious journey.
All right. So I was raised in an Orthodox house, of course. I'm a Bukharian Jew. My parents are from Uzbekistan. They immigrated to New York, and they had me. They weren't religious at all, but when they had me, they started keeping everything. They started becoming Shomer Shabbat, Shomer Kashrus, etc. And of course, I was raised within the Jewish tradition. And then I guess after high school, like in 12th grade, I started to become more curious. I started to watch these random videos on YouTube from like random, just random people, and I started to get more into philosophy. So when I got into my undergrad, my first year, I took a philosophy of ethics, and then I really got into philosophy and political science. And political science is my major. I'm going for law, so I started to get very into like theology and philosophical theism, basically. So at first, I kind of started defending the existence of God. That's what really interested me. I was like, this is something I'm premising my entire life on. So let me just at least get this with clarity, because I saw how much controversy, for example, medical ethics have, or ethics in general, or even like epistemology. There's different branches of philosophy, but every branch of philosophy links back to, I guess, sort of like the ideas behind the universe, and essentially it all goes back to God. So I thought if I can figure out God and I can prove, I guess, the Jewish revelation, then everything would, for the most part, have answers, and I have a framework to live my life by. I guess, again, my practice never really deviated at all. It was always very straightforward. It was always very diligent. But then, so then I started defending these arguments for God's existence. I started with basic Christian apologetics because they were like one of the main people that were producing content of the sort. And of course, I got into this notion of theistic personalism. For those people that would be listening to this, theistic personalism is essentially, for those that aren't familiar, it's the idea of God being more of like this guy in the sky type of being. He's not really the sole source of everything. He just simply is the most powerful being in existence. And I guess potentially speaking, this sort of being, again, the way you prove this sort of being is it would be through probability. It's not really like, oh, well, the universe, for example, exemplifies design. So this God must be the designer. For example, one famous argument of this nature is the Paley's watchmaker argument. So, I mean, I started out with these sorts of arguments, and I realized that these are all probabilistic arguments. And God is really the most perfect being and the most inconceivable being, meaning that we can't really comprehend him in every respect. Basically, I thought that God should be more clear, more, I guess, hardline. So then I got into this another writer. His name is Edward Fazer. He's a professor of philosophy, and essentially he started speaking about classical theism. Classical theism is, I guess in our other phone call I spoke about it. Classical theism is essentially the view that God is the ultimate source of all that is in existence. He's completely simple. And I guess I'll get more into these arguments if that's okay. So the first argument, there are a bunch of them. There's actually over 20 arguments that you can probably give for God's existence in this classical nature. But what I would say out off the bat is that to deny any of these arguments would essentially be to deny your own logical abilities. And if you're going to start to deny your own cognitive faculties to be able to discriminate truth from falsehood, then you can't trust any conclusion you're ever going to come to. So I know that sounds like a huge challenge. I thought, really? But at the same time, I would say that essentially if you're going to deny this conception of God, you are essentially denying your own logical faculties. This is the only other alternative to. And if you deny your own logical faculties, then you cannot be justified in any conclusion you ever come to. So it kind of devolves this type of nihilism, except it's not even nihilism, because you really can't know anything at that point. You can't even know that you don't know anything. So you have to just keep quiet about everything.
Does this in some way validate the belief in God or the belief in the God of the Torah?
Well, I would argue that if the Torah is true, this is the belief in the God. This is what the Torah is speaking about.
Right, if the Torah is true, right? But the argument is that you can prove the existence of God, but not necessarily the God of the Torah. I mean, it could just be some sort of God that created everything and just stepped out of existence.
Yeah, exactly. But the thing is, this sort of God that would be the sole source of existence, he actually wouldn't be able to just step away, because that's actually what deism would propose. Right. Deism is actually the type of God that you're speaking of. He basically created it and then just left it to just manage on its own. I would actually, through my arguments, I'll prove that sort of God is just as irrational as believing in Zeus. Mm-hmm. And the God of, for example, Christianity, which I would argue, and parts of Islam, like Sufism, etc., or even Wahhabism, I would argue that their God that they worship would amount to just believing in some Zeus-type figure. This sort of figure is not something that would exemplify ultimate primacy. It simply is the most, I guess, powerful being of his genus. And this is something that essentially is, there's no proof for these sorts of arguments. Like, they're all probabilistic, and again, this probabilistic argument would undermine itself. If God is a necessary being, then his existence has to be necessary. If you give me a probability...
It sounds to make, the attempt to prove the God of the Bible, the God of the Torah, is still ultimately left up to faith.
I mean, not exactly, because I can prove to you a God. I can prove to you the source of all existence. It exemplifies every maximal attribute, meaning it has omnipotence, omniscience, it has omnipresence, right? It actualizes everything at every single moment, right? It is one, meaning it's completely simple, it's unity.
Yeah, aren't these later developed ideas? Omnipotent, omniscient, and even the notion of being one. You know, for example, I heard rabbis, this famous rabbi, Herschel Schachter, right? He's a posek for the OU. I mean, he's pretty big. I mean, he's pretty up there. He's one of the Rosh Yeshivas in Yeshiva University. So he says on that statement where it says, "Hear Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one," that doesn't necessarily mean his one, because it doesn't really tell us anything, right? But Echad there really means unique, right? That he's unique amongst the gods. So not just is the notion of he being omniscient, omnipotent, or one a developed idea. It's ideas that necessarily don't make or break our belief in the God of the Torah. In other words, it sounds that ultimately our belief system is just a faith like any other faith, right? I mean, what distinguishes God from all other gods that claim to be God is our God from an ethical perspective is a good God, a God that we can emulate, right? But I mean, outside of that, how does this ultimately strengthen Judaism? I mean, it could strengthen your belief in a God, but I mean, that God could very well be Allah, or it could be, like you said, the God of the deists.
Of course. So what I would say is deism, atheism, the sort of belief system that you proposed and that you're speaking of right now, meaning a God that you exemplify that is good, etc. The God of Christianity, where Jesus is the incarnation of God, the Father, and basically there's a Trinity, of course, and again, the gods of Sufism and Wahhabism, even Hinduism, or even Greek and Roman paganism,
or even Orthodoxy.
Whatever it is.
Some Orthodox Jews have some weird understandings of God. The parts of fame, the little face of God, God having a penis. So it seems like Torah itself doesn't really put God in a box like we want him to. Now we understand that almost everything that we know about God, of what he is or what he isn't, is learned from the Rambam, from Mor Nevuchim. But it seems that even Chazal would have broken a lot of his rules with anthropomorphisms of God. Huh?
Yeah, of course. But what I would say is that the Rambam wasn't the first one to, of course, start off this classical theism. I would say that Yonatan ben Uziel, the commentator, the notorious commentator, and even Onkelos have very ethereal and more esoteric understandings of God that would not match the theistic personalism that you're speaking of. But my proposition here is that there's two options. Either you have you would say that this is all faith, like Islam, like Christianity, like Hinduism, and I would say that if that's the case, then nobody really has any reason to believe in this, because there's no more proofs for this than there is anything else. And I would go with Aristotle's approach, and Plato, Pythagoras, I would say that you don't need any sort of revelation to be ethical. For example, if there was no Torah, I wouldn't be inclined to kill people. Like, it's just common sense. Like, I want to live peacefully. I don't think the Torah is there for an ethics. And honestly speaking, like, the Torah isn't really much ethical. Most of the things that a Torah Jew would be doing are more ritualistic things. For example, Pesach, Shavuos, Sukkot. So what I would say is, if you're believing in this sort of understanding of God, right, where he's unique, and he doesn't have ultimate primacy for all reality, he's not necessary essentially, then you're really just believing in another creature, and you really have no reason to believe it.
From my perspective, I don't believe the Torah is there to make you good. I think the Torah is there to make good people better. I think everyone is born with a basic sense of morality, but I do ultimately think it's just another religion. The only difference is there is a litmus test, that if this religion makes you a better person, that's how you know you're in the right religion, because it works. That's it. If our religion didn't work, then we should be looking for another religion. I think there's more than just leaving it up to faith or blind faith. There is a way to prove that, these commandments are exceptional. This belief system is exceptional. If people keep it, things improve. If people don't, they don't. I mean, we see places like the Soviet Union who basically tossed out the ethics, right, the ethical portions of the Bible, i.e. the Torah, any instruction from God, and they leave a trail of carnage. And Christianity and Islam claim to be ethical, not because of the narrative they've added to the mix, but the core of their writings, which is the Torah. So this is why it works.
Yeah, but I would say, for instance, you're saying a limit says to make good people better. What is good and what is better? For instance, not killing people, not stealing. Because in ancient Rome, for example, the philosophers were the ones that exemplified these sorts of ethical notions. They really spoke about them and they cultivated them. There's hundreds of literature, hundreds of books that were written in the ancient times, even before certain books of the Bible were written. So, like, for example, Aristotle, right? Or even, for example, Plato or Socrates. These people existed even before, for example, the book of Daniel came about. So what I would say is that it's very tricky what makes a good person better. That really is a subjective question.
Do you believe ethics are relative?
No, I would say a certain degree of ethics, for instance, not killing, not stealing, these things are for the most part objective to the human. They're not, for example, if there's no human being, there obviously is absolutely no ethics. But what I would say is there's no ethics in the animal kingdom, for instance. But if there's a human being, then there's a human being that has abstract reasoning and capabilities to negotiate. It has to abide by certain common sense beliefs. And I would actually say that it's a mix of Immanuel Kant ethics and John Stuart Mill, for instance, and Jeremy Bentham. There's utilitarianism and there's more principle fairness. Even apes, for example, exemplify certain degrees of fairness.
Mm-hmm. I give the example of the Soviet Union, how when a society abandons the belief in God, in a judging God that commands us to do certain things, they leave a trail of death and carnage. In other words, it's not just a book of ceremonial laws, or mostly ceremonial laws, but there's an ethical backbone that gives us the assurance that something is wrong, not just because it feels wrong, but because God says it's wrong. It seems that the Torah is exceptional from that perspective. This is why it is the father or mother of all the major ethical monotheistic belief systems. That being said, I still believe it's a faith, and I think it's important to reiterate that because a lot of people become religious on the basis that they can prove everything, and then when some skeptical college kid disproves their hypothesis, they drop everything, right? Instead of saying, no, this works. As a matter of fact, I encourage atheists to act like they believe in the Bible for the sake of their children, because studies show that children who are raised with some sort of religious, ethical, monotheistic basis live happier, richer, fuller lives. They give more charity. In other words, it behooves them to want to at least hope that God exists. And I always classify myself not as a believer, but as an optimistic agnostic. In other words, I think it's unhealthy to walk around saying that I know that God exists, right? I mean, I think Rambam, like the Rambam Memorandum has a statement that if I knew God, I'd be God. But I think the healthy individual sees the need for God, right? Sees the result of societies and how they progress and how families, flourish in many aspects because they believe and they fear an ethical God. So I think the healthy approach is to be an optimistic agnostic versus a pessimistic agnostic, right? I mean, the whole notion of an atheist, that really doesn't exist. That's just what Halakha calls a mumar lechachis, a heretic who's angry with God to the point that he makes a statement. He stands on a soapbox and he says, I know God doesn't exist, just like the fanatic says, I know he does exist. This is why I like calling it a faith in a religion, just like every other religion, with the exception that this one actually works.
I mean, again, there has to be more qualifiers here. Like, what does it mean to work? What does it mean to be better? But what I would say again is that I would acknowledge that obviously there needs to be a God. But I wouldn't really agree with the point that there needs to be a God for ethical purposes. I would say there needs to be a God as an intellectual backbone for all of our realities that we experience and acknowledge intellectually. So, for example, if we acknowledge the existence of contingent things, for example, I'm looking at my fridge right now, right? And you could ask to yourself, well, why is this fridge here in existence? You could say, well, it's in existence because it's made up of because of the parts. For example, there's the door, there's the cables, etc. Well, what makes those up? And you're going to say, well, what do you mean? It's just further metal part.
Why does the world need that? I don't understand that.
Yeah.
I mean, if it doesn't affect the way you behave, then what good is it?
The thing is, it would affect, but I would say is it gives you a strong realization of what God is. And I would say that if the Torah, for instance, if, for example, we read the chapter in when Avram was in the tent and the three angels came as God, if we read that verse and we acknowledge that those three angels, those three men were actually a manifestation of God, a necessary being, then right away we falsify the entire Torah. Just like the Torah telling us that essentially that 2 + 2 is 30. That's exactly what it would be like.
So we wouldn't nullify it from an ethical perspective. I'm not saying as a sort of limitation of God.
It's the backbone of the Torah. if the backbone of the Torah, for example, the deity is wrong, essentially, it's not wrong. It's like it's impossible to believe in such a thing. Then ethically speaking, you have really no reason to trust it. And I could just refer you, for example. And again, obviously, you need God for ethical purposes to believe in design. For example, your eyes have a purpose to see, your nose has a purpose to smell. What's the purpose of human being? To flourish, essentially. That's what Aristotle would say for happiness. I think happiness, he would say, is not a feeling; it's more of an activity. In the Nicomachean Ethics, that's what he speaks of. So, essentially, his source of morality would not be because I'm afraid of God. It would be because I want to be an exemplary human being, and I want the human race to flourish as a species. Like I should.
Can the belief system of the God of Israel be ethical and at the same time, in certain cases, irrational?
It would have to be if the deity that was conceived of was actually impossible, had an impossible existence. Yeah, it would be. You have no reason to trust the ethics it proposes.
I think that really depends on what you consider divinely inspired text. For example, if you have to try to reinterpret every part of Torah that we consider narrative in order for your religion and your God to make sense, perhaps you're labeling things divinely inspired that really shouldn't be considered divinely inspired. In other words, the portion of the individual who came, or the three individuals who came to speak to Abraham, that's not really part of Torah, right? I mean, that's not anything instructional. That's giving you part of the narrative, but we don't even know who necessarily wrote that. Tradition tells us it was written by Moses. Fine, I accept that, but that's not what was given in Har Sinai. In other words, that doesn't make or break our religion. So in other words, the Rambam going out of his way...
But it would make or break our religion if our religion says that this deity is the one that gave us all these ethical norms, essentially. If this deity, for example, is disproven, then we could just say that these ethics were just something that were built up over time from cultural diffusion and just essentially trial and error.
Only because it's not logically understood, logically or rationally understood, what doesn't defeat his existence. I mean, perhaps we just can't understand it. Here, for example, only because in Torah he seems to limit himself by certain times appearing to people in human form doesn't mean that his whole existence is null and void, right? According to...
Depends on the God you're conceiving of. If, for instance, you're conceiving of a God like Zeus, where he appears, for example, and impregnates a virgin and has Prometheus, I forgot the way it works, or Osiris, for example, then yeah, sure, you can believe in that, but you really have no justification over Zeus and Osiris to believe in Yahweh, for instance. But, for example, if I see God the same way the Rambam sees God, the Ralbag sees God, or even Aristotle, St. Augustine, if I see God that way, then that existence is already fortified. That's what I'm trying to say.
For example, there's a medrash that says, it brings on the notion of Tikkun Sofrim, that Chazal actually stepped into the text, into the narrative of Tanakh, and changed things around, lest people build erroneous, i.e. irrational ideas on what the God of Israel is or it's not, because of the way the text is formulated. So they stepped in and they took letters out, put words in, according to an obscure medrash, right? But this is problematic. Now, it shows that they had a certain level of integrity to even mention it, and specifically mention the portions that they modified. And I think one portion they did mention was that instance that you mentioned of the three Malachim coming to speak to Avraham Avinu. I think that's more problematic than to just say, Torah was given on Mount Sinai, at least according to the narrative. Like we know that if there was a Sefer Bereshit, that would have been the last book written of the 5 books, and we should just literally follow the narrative that the only encounter humanity ever really had with God was on Mount Sinai, which was ultimately transmitted through Moses, and that, ultimately a leap of faith to believe, but it's fine, it's a leap of faith that helps people improve and helps the society progress, so that's almost like necessary to our belief system. I think that...
if that God that you're speaking of doesn't exist, and even if he would exist, he's not the sole source of everything. There's something metaphysically prior to him that is simple and that actually actualizes that being that you're speaking of, then you have no reason to believe in anything, because you see this guy as, for example, all-powerful, because there's nothing like him, right? He's the greatest, for instance. He's not the greatest if he's that being that the superficial reading of the Torah or the Christian understanding of the Torah is understood, then you really have no reason to believe in anything. So I'm saying is, in my understanding, it's either Rambam or it's nothing. You really have no reason to believe in anything if you don't have the Rambam's perspective. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, you could call it faith, but I would just say it's 100% irrational. And it's not irrational like believing in something improbable. I think it's irrational like saying 2 + 2 is 30. Because a necessary being is a being that needs to exist by its own necessity. It's uncaused because of its necessary nature.
But who set up these rules? That's the thing. I agree with
I mean,
you.
no, we don't.
Like from a philosophical perspective, I agree with you. But in terms of having to believe this, mind you, the average person throughout history who studied Torah probably didn't have what we considered a high school education nowadays, but it still made them great individuals, and perhaps they had some anthropomorphic understanding of God. I don't think it made them any less ethical, and I don't think it made God any less rational from their perspective, right? Now, according to Platonic or Aristotelian thought, perhaps there's some sort of ethical limitation there, but I mean, the philosophers could be wrong. The Rambam could be wrong, especially when he starts
I mean, I
telling
would
people.
argue that to say that the Rambam or any of these philosophers like Aristotle, Plato, Plotinus, St. Augustine, even St. Thomas Aquinas, to say that they were wrong is to essentially take their entire logical capabilities and throw them out the window. And if, again, we
I'm
don't
not
have
saying they're wrong.
logic,
I'm saying they could be wrong. In other words, it
no,
sounds.
if they are wrong, you never be able to know it, and you wouldn't be able to know that you wouldn't know it. I'm saying you have no ability to reason through anything if these people are wrong. So I'm saying it's either your only option as an integrative human being that reasons through things
It
is to
sounds
say
like
that
we
they're
were
right.
writing
And
the Torah. So
huh?
Rambam says if anyone has that God appeared to someone in human form, that only happened in a vision, and that didn't really happen in real life because that would be some sort of limitation of God. In other words, the Rambam's there rewriting the narrative. It says that God brought Israel out of Egypt with a strong hand. Now, clearly, I don't believe God has a hand, but if someone did believe that, I don't know why that conversation should ever be entertained. But that someone who believes that loses their chelik in Olam Haba, as the Rambam writes in Hilchos Tshuva. I don't know if Israel is better off because of it, and I think the Rambam came to these conclusions because he lived in an Islamic society, and what Muslims are known for is almost being like monotheistic junkies, which is not a bad thing, but this is what they focused on so much, and this is what the Rambam grew up with, right? With the Tosafis, had a different understanding, perhaps because they grew up in Christian societies, but it seems that the Rambam was working with a lot of developed ideas. In other words, anyone who reads the Torah straight through, I really doubt that they would come to a similar understanding of what God is or what God isn't. I mean, for sure, Chazal didn't have this understanding. Like, most of them didn't even believe that the earth was round. I just kind of think that the more we complicate God, we're kind of putting a stumbling block for people who sort of build their whole religious experience on some sort of rational understanding of God, and then someone proves that, you know what, the Torah itself is not necessarily rational, and then they drop the whole belief system because of that and not because of ethical monotheism. In other words, the Torah is ethical, and that's what makes this book exceptional. This is why we should follow God, not because we could rationally prove his existence and what he is or what he is not. I agree with you.
Well, again, before I started to cut you off, but before we speak about the ethics of the Torah, I want to say that there are a lot of controversial things that are brought down in the Torah. For example, Abraham going and trying to sacrifice his son. I don't think anyone, unless you're arguing in a circle, you're presupposing the ethics of the Torah and trying to just assuming that. But as an ethical person, for someone to go and try to slaughter his son is not a justified thing to do. I'm saying that's kind of irrational. It's kind of insane.
I completely agree.
Right?
That's one example I give.
The slaughtering of the Canaanites, or the slaughtering of the children of Amalek, or Levi and Simeon going and, for example, which is butchering Shechem. I think these things are immoral 100%. I think, for example, what Joseph did.
Well, that's not a good example, because it shows that Yaakov also thought it was immoral, by the way. Yaakov, in terms of what they did to Shechem, he was upset at what they did. In terms of killing the children of the Amalekites, that doesn't really appear in Torah. Shmuel gave that command. But there's a handful of instances. Here, for example, I don't walk around saying that the Torah is perfect. Okay, I accept it because I accept the bulk of the ethical precepts that appear in the Torah. That validates the existence of a good God to me, right? If I agree with someone 90 or 95% of the time, and I agree with the Torah more than 95% of the time, I consider him a friend, and in this case, I consider the book worthy of my time, and in this case, my emulation. In other words, I want to emulate a good God. But I don't walk around saying that I accept the Torah as perfectly rational, ethically rational, and that it makes perfect sense to me. I really wish there's some portions of the Torah that would have been worded differently.
Oh, but then how could you make the argument that the Torah is one of the most ethical documents ever written? I wouldn't even say that. I would say, for example, Aristotle is not making an ethics order, or his De Anima order, because he doesn't have any of these sort of things. He would say anyone who does is a deplorable human being.
Yeah, the Torah predates Aristotle and it predates Plato.
I mean, that's actually a bit controversial according to biblical scholars, but I mean,
if you believe that the Torah was given in the accepted date that the Bible says it was given, then you would just plug that into when history teaches Aristotle and Plato existed. That Plato was a student of Aristotle and was a teacher to Alexander the Great, or vice versa, which would have been in and around the time of the Maccabees.
Aristotle, Plato, but what I'm saying is essentially that saying that the Torah is ethical, I'm saying I can probably find you more ethical documents than that. especially if you're reading the Torah superficially, which you would when it comes to understanding God. So I don't see how you can justify it.
I mean, there's a quote from Arabi, there's the Book of the Dead. It's not that other belief systems weren't ethical at the time, but they weren't as consistently ethical. What's the point of following the God of Israel if he's just as ethical as like the Epic of Gilgamesh or the Odyssey, right? I mean, what makes God God is that he's good. That's how he validates himself to us. I mean, anyone could claim to have created you or created the world. That's not really proof. But at the time when this book was written, and where he makes his presence known in history, he appears at a time where gods behaved worse than people, right? That we have a God that we could actually emulate, that by emulating his actions, that we could actually make this world a better place. The Rambam writes down in Sefer HaMitzvot that we have a mitzvah to emulate God, to be merciful as he is merciful, to be kind as he is kind. That's what makes him God. I appreciate...
But again, maybe I would give you this argument if we live, for example, in the time of Egypt. Yeah, you're right. Compared to everything else in existence, which is even controversial. So the Book of the Dead, or for example, the stuff of Osiris, I heard, actually I think that wasn't the Book of the Dead, where it speaks about feeding the hungry, taking care of everyone, whatever it is. Sacrificing, of course, that was a huge thing in those cultures. Maybe back then, I would tell you Torah is the most ethical thing and you should follow it. But pragmatically speaking, nowadays, I don't think that would make you an ethical person to follow the Torah to the letter law, like an Orthodox Jew. Most people would see the segregation between men and women completely abhorrent. Like, what are you talking? I can't sit on the couch with my wife when she's, for example, on her Nida cycle. Like, that sounds a bit like treating them like cattle. Or, for example,
it's not
at
an
weddings,
ethical law, it's a ceremonial law.
I mean, it seems ethical. Like, oh, there's a certain type of tree, or Sholotani Isha, Sholotani Goy, Sholotani Ave. These things seem very...
Yeah, but that's not in the Torah either. I mean, that's rabbinic.
I think, for example, these things that the rabbis are learning from the Torah. That's their framework, I'm saying. So we can say that is...
I mean, the notion of Sholotani Goy or Sholotani Isha is not from the Torah. I mean, I understand we have a commandment to say it, right? Yeah, but Chazal also make mistakes. I mean, there's a whole... Masechet Horayot that deal with the errors of the Beis Din Hagadol. It's not that they were perfect. That we do what they say because we're commanded to.
Okay, so let's say Torah more, for example. You think it would be ever justified if your son is, for example, eating meat and wine to go and slaughter him? Or, for example, I just don't see these things being ethical now.
No, right. I agree. That's one example. I mean, although gives us all the benefit of the doubt here in terms of the way, but they teach that no son was ever killed like in Eretz Yisrael because this ensured that the parents weren't allowed to kill their kids because they were commanded to bring them to the court and it was the court that would kill them. But I really wish that this would have been worded differently, right? I mean, there's certain things in the Torah that most atheists use to disprove the Torah. I mean, it's really just a handful of arguments that many people have used to drop it completely. Like I said, if I agree with something, even 98% of the time, which is really my approach to Torah, I consider it, at least at the time that it arose, the most powerful ethical system ever, I guess, devised by man, if you believe, like the Torah was written by man, right? In other words, it existed at a time where the world was on a very low ethical level, right? Or it's easy for people to claim to be ethical nowadays because they're standing on the shoulders of giants. In other words, almost everyone alive has a grandparent or great-grandparent who was religious, right, and has transferred those ethics down to them. But ultimately, when people drop God completely, it's almost like what's called cut flower ethics. Their philosophy will ultimately end up catching up with them. And like I said, with examples like the former Soviet Union, that when people drop God, murder and chaos follow, right? But I'm sure you agree with that.
I mean, not necessarily. I mean, what about, for example, Netherlands? You take Europe nowadays. Netherlands, you take Denmark. The atheists, there's actually, I think you can count on your fingers the amount of churches that, or any sort of religious affiliations even that exist in those countries, and they're all considered ethical countries. I just don't think that I think it's all really about the upbringing.
No, that's a good point. However, like the Netherlands and Norway and all these countries go back over 100 years, and they were religious. In other words, now they're in some way delving with secularism and leftism, right? But I believe that eventually their philosophy will end up catching up with them, and by them importing hundreds of thousands of migrant workers and Arabs from the Middle East is proof that they have no ethical backbone to stand on, where they don't even reproduce anymore. In other words, these individuals were religious. This is why it continues for a little while. But I guess time will tell.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I hear what you're saying, but at the same time, when it comes to these countries like Norway, Netherlands, whatever it is, most of these countries, I think it was a fallacy that they mentioned. I think Sam Harris was the one that mentioned it. He said just because a country started off religious and it's ethical doesn't mean that it's because of the fact that it's religious and it's ethical. Same when it comes to the Christian ethics. I don't think just because things started off that way, there's a natural tendency for people to want to cooperate and to mitigate their circumstances together. I think that's just what it is. And I think you can give an evolutionary basis for this based off studying apes, studying dolphins, even, or any animal essentially that has abstract thinking, like elephants, dolphins, like I said. Even chimpanzees have a strong sense of fairness. I can give you an example. A few years ago, I think it was, there was one zoo worker who on a birthday, on the chimp's birthday, gave the chimp a cake. This is on the news. And the chimp essentially saw that they had the cake, and the chimp that got the cake, every other chimp got so jealous of them that they killed the guy completely. I'm saying they have a sense of fairness that they would go and rip someone apart for. Even chickens have this to an extent. Or for example, you take a cow, right?
So which would be deemed unethical according to the Torah in terms of like killing a other monkey because he got a piece of cake and those monkeys.
No, but they didn't kill the guy who gave it. This sense of ethics that exists between fairness. So this is fairness. This just demonstrates fairness. They said you gave them, but not us, essentially. But this just demonstrates fairness. They have a fairness. Obviously, it's not as cultivated as ours.
Yeah, something could be fair and unethical, correct?
Yeah, of course. Like Immanuel Kant, for example, the famous categorical imperative. Of course, this could be
like
perverted.
Eye for an eye would never really existed in Torah, or at least in the Jewish world, right? It was understood as monetary payback, compensation.
Yeah. But what I'm saying is the ethics, we can't have an evolutionary development. That being an ethical individual or whatever it is does contribute more to your survival. Therefore, this is something that would be expounded upon. But to use this as a proof of the God of Israel, I think would be extremely weak and not even that compelling, honestly. I think you do need historicity to qualify your argument. For example, proving the Exodus, proving, for example, these historical events that would substantiate the Jewish faith.
No, my argument is it's the only thing that makes it exceptional. In other words, any other God could claim the same rational or logical attribute, but not the same ethical one. In other words, at that time it meant something. So nowadays, from our perspective, all we have to do is pay tribute. And I think that's really the responsibility of every religious individual nowadays, to know where their ethics come from. Our ethics came from the Bible. We pay tribute to that. And that's what makes us religious individuals. Nowadays, nobody walks around executing laws of fairness like these monkeys do. Huh? What?
It's not so clear that our ethics do come from the Bible. That's what I'm trying to say. There is an evolutionary component to it. And evolution would dictate that whatever is advantageous to survival would of course, persevere. But ethics, obviously, is just part of that. We'll go into that.
I think one example is that any society that's tossed
out
the Bible...
Culture through the Bible manifested itself into modern times through the Bible. But to say that it's because of the Bible, it would be a fallacy of composition. It would be committing a lot of fallacies here. I just don't think how... I don't see how that can follow. Just because it happened through the Bible...
Well, at least Western society, for sure. How could you deny that?
Western society was kind of more. I would even say, for example, St. Thomas Aquinas, even these people that are this all came honestly from Greek thought.
St. Thomas Aquinas was a Catholic priest.
He was, and he premised, if you read the Summa Theologica, Summa Contra Gentiles, he was quoting Aristotle left and right. He was quoting these Platonic philosophers left and right. Ibn Sina, who actually
the Rambam considered Aristotle like the highest level of ethical and godly man. In other words, he didn't consider him an atheist.
He had no Torah.
Because the Rambam was of the opinion that one could learn ethics from nature. But of course, the Rambam was a student of Aristotle. He says this is why, like Chazal mentioned that we could learn modesty from a cat, and we could learn how to be productive by watching ants. Right? This is the Rambam's approach. This isn't Torah, I mean, I
would say it's all just pragmatism. Just pragmatically speaking, do you want to, for example, steal from your neighbor and take the risk of being stolen from? There's always going to be someone stronger, smarter. I'm saying, practically speaking, you would want to establish a code of laws. So honestly speaking, I don't see how ethics can go and prove any sort of religious faith, because anything you show me in the Torah, I can just find the older roots that have this. For example, the Book of the Dead.
How can you adjudicate a society on that basis? In other words, if you create a bunch of judges who create laws that seem to be absolute, then you're making that court into God. In other words, why should they have the authority to impose laws on me if we've come to the conclusion that there is no law, and these laws are just man-made and subjective? We know that murder is wrong because God says that murder is wrong. Now, clearly, it's a knowledge based off of faith. If not...
You can't claim that God says it. It's just a claim.
Right.
So for example, the air...
I mean, it's ultimately all faith. It's ultimately all faith. But if God doesn't say it, then we will never know it's wrong because it's just opinion.
Not necessarily. It's not opinion. It's more just intuition. I don't think it's opinion. I think it's intuition for one not to kill the other. I don't need God to tell me that to be able to know that.
With a history that would prove you wrong. In other words, in terms of the former Soviet Union and places that have replaced God with their own form of system, whether it's Mao's Little Red Book, Das Kapital, right? In other words, these are all replacement for God.
But they're not, though. These people just want to exercise pragmatism, and they want to keep their control. They don't really claim to have any sort of... They're just doing exactly what they want. And, of course, if absolute power corrupts, absolutely, that's why they were so immoral. But taking, again, Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, Pythagoras, Parmenides, Xenophon, these people didn't have God. I mean, they had my understanding, the classical theistic understanding of God. But they wouldn't say that God basically dictated killing is wrong. I think that's just very reductionistic, and it's just oversimplifying things. And people that would accept, it's not really compelling at all. There's really nothing about that would follow. So that essentially says that if God said this is wrong, therefore it's wrong. But what if we said it was right to kill? Then we can go and kill?
No, then it would be unbecoming of a good God. In other words, there's a basic sense of morality, a basic sense. This is why I don't believe the Torah is there.
That's the sense that you're relying on. It's not the God that told you to do it. So it goes back to the person's like intuitive sense of not to kill, not to, for example, sleep with one's close relatives. That's just common sense.
Right, that's part of a basic sense of morality. But I think the Torah is there to make good people better.
To use the sense of morality, to use the Torah, to establish the Torah's truth. So to say that it comes from the Torah is wrong. It's coming from your sense of morality.
In terms of murder and theft, I agree. Okay, but in terms of honoring your parents for resting on the Sabbath, even the whole notion of the Shemitah year, things that actually improve society and have improved society. In other words, these are things that I don't think are intuitive. I think that we need a good God to tell us, to tell kids to fear their parents. If a man gets a woman pregnant, right, and it would benefit him to eliminate her, to kill her, than to raise this child, what would stop him from doing it? I mean, it would benefit him clearly to murder her. In other words, there has to be one God.
In the long run, because that would basically cause retaliation. So that wouldn't benefit him, if anything. So I can make actually a pragmatic argument for why these things should not be done. It wouldn't benefit you to go and kill someone just because they're pissing you off, because essentially it'll just cause a retaliation of some sort. It'll cause a vengeance, a feud of some sort, which essentially would just kill more people. So no, I think these ethics are intuitive to the natural man. I don't think you need to rely on God. And again, if you're taking the Torah's ordinances, the moral ordinances, and you're judging them...
History hasn't proven that. That's the thing. There hasn't been a society that's been ethical without the ethics that appear in Torah. Can you give me a society...
It's because of their personal misconstrual. For example, Aristotle was not an unethical person, for instance.
Right.
Or again, he had no Bible.
But the word I should use is consistently ethical. In other words, there's societies that could have certain instances in their society that are ethical, but consistently ethical. This is why the Torah could go up against the Book of the Dead, the Odyssey, the Iliad, or any ancient document and prove itself even more ethical. I'm not saying perfect, right, but more ethical than what we had in place. This is why Western society has flourished.
But that means we can make something more ethical than the Torah. So why don't we just make something more ethical than the Torah? I'm saying we can do that. And again, we can use history and we can use philosophy to demonstrate how the philosophical underpinnings of the Torah are wrong.
So
essentially, it's just a developing morality. So let's make something better than the Torah. Thank you, Torah, for making us a successful society. Even if I would grant you that argument, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
But we do see certain immoralities. Let's chuck the Torah because philosophically and historically speaking, it seems inaccurate. And let's make something better. That's based off of historical and philosophical accuracies. I'm saying there would be nothing wrong with that.
I think in terms of the Torah, you'd really be dealing with narrative. In terms of you're looking at something to improve, or one or two mitzvot in the Torah, right? In terms of trying to make something so much more ethical, now we do have the court that tries to improve on it. In other words, the court is there to keep Israel progressing slowly in an ethical fashion. It says if areas of dispute arise at your gates, you take it to the court. But the Torah lays down the bare bones. Like I said, I've heard great explanations for portions of the Torah that I don't ethically understand. Right, but I really wish that those portions would have been worded differently in the Torah. Okay, they're not. I'm not going to walk around blindly saying that.
Most source of authority, ethical authority, you already don't have that because you see unethical teachings. So I'm saying that kind of undermines the argument already. Because if people were exercising exactly what the Torah says, then they would not be considered ethical people. That's what I'm trying to say. And the tradition is just the development, the historical development, cultural development. So there's really no reason to just premise yourself on these things. I think essentially you have to premise yourself on philosophical arguments for the simplicity and unity, oneness of God, ultimate primacy of God, and for historical basis, like Godly tries to do, and I would even argue Godly fails to do, like proving the historicity of the sign of Revelation. I wouldn't buy that argument, personally. I think there are better arguments out there. But I think you need historicity and you need philosophy. Otherwise, these ethical things just become very relative and subjective. And again, if there's someone that comes along and proves the relativity of ethics, the subjectivity of this, then the entire argument falls apart. And I think, for example, John Markey, J.L. Markey, people like J.L. Markey, even, for example, people like Bertrand Russell, they really did do a heavy blow on objective moral teaching. They had a huge hit on that. So I'm saying that this argument wouldn't really work for a lot of people that are in university studying, because they really delve into ethics in a very deep manner. And especially, personally for me, it wouldn't work, because I see a lot of holes in it. I think there's a lot of thinkers like Plotinus was actually a pagan, right? Plotinus was a pagan, but he still understood God, and it's because of his understanding of the One, which he called as God in his book, The Aeneid, that he came to an ethical system. Same when it comes to Augustine. He proved God's existence, and then he saw the Bible, and of course, obviously the New Testament, which I would say contradicts this philosophical system. But I'm saying
so you would consider this.
But I also talk from God.
So you would consider this a Rambamist understanding of God? I mean, most people haven't studied Moreh Nevuchim. I mean, right when they start reading it, I mean, it's not the easiest read. But would you consider this the Rambam's approach to God and ethics?
I mean, yeah. I mean, just tangentially speaking, I do think some things Rambam said, even philosophically, wouldn't really work out. Like for example, when he said that Avram saw these angels in a dream. I think God appearing to someone, even in a dream, in a contingent fashion, would undermine his necessities. So I don't think Rambam really avoids the question. He just tries to conjure up anything to answer that. But I think even the Rambam was wrong. But I think that approach, that rationalist approach, is really the only way to make sense of religion. Otherwise, you have all integrity to chuck it, especially if the conception of God proves to be impossible, like 2 + 3 = 30, which I can demonstrate very easily.
I like your approach. So, what do you consider yourself from a Judaic perspective? Do you consider yourself an Orthodox rationalist? Yeah. I mean,
I would say more an Orthodox pragmatist rationalist. So, like, for instance, I would say that certain parts of the Torah you have to abide by because of, I think most of the Torah that you abide by, I would say with you, I'd agree with a lot of its teachings, like the family values. The way my family was raised, I would say, is amazing. And because of the way that it was premised on the Torah, on learning, I would say that the stress, the constant stress on learning and expanding your knowledge is amazing in a secular society, especially for cultivating your intellect, and then essentially this leads into other great fields. I think there's beauty in the Jewish upbringing, 100%. But certain parts of the Jewish upbringing can really turn you into a Taliban, just like Islam and Christianity can. So I would say that you really need to be careful with certain things that you understand. It all comes from understanding. If your philosophy is warped, if your understanding of God is warped, understanding of reward and punishment is warped, I would say there's really no such thing as reward and punishment, by the way. I would say it's all just consequence. Reward and punishment is kind of just a child's understanding of the notion. But it's all consequence. You do this, this is the consequence. Even for example, in Parshat B'Chukotai, when it says you don't keep my ordinances, I'm going to strike you down, you're going to be starving, etc. I would say that these are, again, he's just speaking to
they can be consequential. In other words, if you don't do right X, Y will happen. Right?
Yeah.
If you don't keep the Shemitah year, then you're going to destroy the soil, right?
Yeah, exactly. Or, for example, essentially, that's what it involves. But I would say that I do have this, I would say that I am Islamic in the sense that I have this ethical, I have this intellectual obsession with monotheism. And I think that is actually one of the things we should pull out of Islam, which the Rambam did, of course.
Right.
This understanding of God is something that really you keep with yourself at all times. And I think, I already told you earlier, I memorized actually lots of surahs in the Quran because I think that those teachings actually originated from Judaism. So you actually, I don't know if you knew, but
they're from the early Gaon.
Yeah, of course. Like, for example, Surah Al-Ikhlas in the Quran, it starts, Kul hu Allahu Akhad. It says, listen, I say God is one. Allahu Samad means he's self-sufficient. Lam yalad wa lam yulad. He does not beget, nor does he begotten. Wa lam yakun kufuwan ahad. And there's nothing like him in existence. This is a completely a Jewish concept.
I've always considered Islam a corrupted form of Judaism. I mean, even Arabic. I mean, Arabic sounds more like Temanite. Right, absolutely. Right. I mean, Tamarim nowadays.
Yeah, but I don't know if you actually knew, but Muhammad, 2 of his wives were Jewish. And he had a lot of exposure to the Jewish people because of the Jews of Medina and Mecca. They were all traders, and they were all interacting with him.
Sure.
So he had a lot of exposure to them, and his understanding of God came straight out of them. And the fact that Islam, for instance, has such an obsession with monotheism, I would say that actually comes back to Judaism. I would say that doesn't come from Islam. It's actually a Jewish notion that made its way into Islam.
No, the Rambam made it popular. I mean, Judaism had a problem with things being codified.
That notion. Yeah. So what I would say is that the Jews abandoned that notion of complete monotheism and this obsession with monotheism after the Muslims made it so big. They made that their pillar. The Jews wanted to like step aside from it a little, kind of like prostration. The Muslims took it. The Jews were like, all right, you take that, we're gonna leave it alone a little. But I'm saying I think it was a mistake personally. You need to go back to those roots. I think that's what makes your religion true. That's what undergirds it completely. You know.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say that that's something that's unfortunate, but it always needs to be stressed that there is a God that's the sole source of all that's in existence, and he's simple, meaning he has no distinctions between his essence and his existence. He is simply necessary existence. He's on cause, and he's the sole cause of everything else. It seems a little impersonal, actually, this conception of God, and this is I took a course this past semester in college, and I had a Protestant preacher that I had to debate with, and he always condemned, like, my conception of the classical theism. He's like, oh, well, your God just doesn't seem like he's relational. And I was like, what do you mean relational? Like a human being relational? He's like, yeah. I was like, well, if he's relational like me and you are, then he'd be contingent, and I need something to explain him. So I was like, you're not giving me any alternative. I would say that in his essence, he's not relational, but it gives us the capability to be able to relate to his essence through our intellect. So I told him he's relational in a more of a passive sense. He's not more like active relational like we are. But of course, he didn't like those explanations. But I think that's the issue with Christianity. It's more like a paganized version of Judaism.
Mm-hmm.
That's why I would say Christianity falls apart 100% because of their understanding of the incarnation and the Trinity. The Trinity, of course, is more of like the Nicene Creed, but the incarnation, which is what we see in John, for example, the first chapter, the first 10 verses, whatever it is, we can even see it in the book of Timothy. We can see it all over Paul's writings, the fact that Jesus seems to be some sort of incarnation of God. I think that this really just falsifies. That's like saying that 2 + 2 = 80. If you have a necessary being, then he cannot have any contingent manifestations. The opposite of necessity is contingency or impossibility. You know?
Mm-hmm.
So if, for example, we say that God, for example, can be contingent in any way, then that undermines necessity 100%. He cannot be necessary then if he could be contingent. So all of his attributes have to be necessary.
I understand how you say that, but that's really in spite of what appears in Torah. In other words, Torah has a huge limitation to it that, if understood literally, would show that God is contingent.
Well, then that would falsify the Torah, essentially. Because
Well.
it's not contingent, what caused God?
Not necessarily the Torah, but the narrative within the Torah. Like, not necessarily the commandments in the Torah, right? I mean, most commandments...
Premise on the narrative, essentially. If, for example, we take out the narrative of Sinai, saying that they saw a likeness of an emerald or something like that, or if we get rid of these narratives, like the Exodus, for example, as well as Kimhi, for instance, then you really have no Pesach. You have, for example, no Shavuos, and most of the commandments fall apart. If there's no narrative, I would say,
the understanding is that the narrative was transmitted through tradition, right? So you have men telling you what they were told. The commandments stand on whether they work or not. That's what makes it exceptional and worth following, because these commandments work, right? I mean, people place too much faith on narrative, thinking that if the narrative doesn't work...
But I would actually say that